Usually when we look at major historical texts, we tend to view them almost like a completed building. You walk around it, you admire the architecture, maybe read the little bronze plaque outside.
Right, like it's a polished museum piece.
Exactly. But occasionally, if you dig deep enough, you get your hands on something much more, well, urgent. You aren't looking at a peaceful blueprint. You're looking at a survival manual written in real time.
Yeah, written right while the ground is violently shaking underneath the author's feet. It's a foundational structure, but it's being designed in the middle of absolute chaos.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a really fascinating piece of source material from Fazioli Publishing. It's titled Day 6, God Delivers His People, the Institution of the Passover.
And our mission for this deep dive is to explore the historical and theological layers of the book of Exodus, specifically chapter 12, verses 1 through 30.
Because we really want to examine how this ancient narrative of the Israelites being delivered from Egypt wasn't just like a physical rescue mission, it was the foundation for an entirely new spiritual framework.
It really was.
I mean, imagine setting the scene for a second. We are talking about a dramatic, terrifying night in ancient Egypt that literally restarted time for an entire nation. We are looking at the blueprint of a story that has survived for millennia.
And the source material approaches it with exactly that level of gravity. It treats this text not just as a historical event, but as a crucial theological bridge.
Right.
What we're examining is a dual narrative. On one hand, it's the visceral story of Israel escaping slavery. But as the author highlights, it's also a direct foreshadowing of Christian redemption.
So before we even get to the famous escape itself, the running in the night, the panic, the parting of the sea, we have to look at the very first instruction God gave to Moses and Aaron.
Because that instruction fundamentally altered how these people measured time.
Yeah, it set the stage for the highly specific sacrifice that was going to be required of them.
The instruction in Exodus 12, verse 2, is remarkably blunt. God tells them, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months."
Which is just wild.
It is. It wasn't just a minor administrative calendar update. It was a complete chronological reset. The text points out that this marked a new calendar and a massive turning point in their history.
It's incredible to think about the psychological weight of a calendar change like that. It's like a deeply personal before and after moment, but on a national scale.
Yeah, a total severance from the past.
Think about anyone, maybe even you listening right now, who has survived a massive life-altering event, maybe a serious illness, or leaving a really destructive situation. Your previous life essentially ends, and you start measuring your age from day one of your new life.
Like when people say, "I'm 5 years cancer-free."
Exactly. You are no longer defined by the timeline of your pain. You are defined by the timeline of your freedom.
And that psychological severance is absolutely crucial for a nation of slaves. You can't build a new, free society if you're still operating on the timeline of your oppressors.
So true.
And once that new timeline is established, the instructions pivot immediately to the mechanism of that freedom, the lamb.
Right. The specific instructions for the lamb in verses 3 through 6.
A year-old male without blemish. And they were told to select it and keep it until the 14th day of the month.
Which means they aren't just grabbing a random animal out of the field in a sheer panic. They're bringing it into their homes.
They're essentially living with it for days.
The anticipation must have been heavy. You have this creature living in your space, and you know exactly what's going to happen to it.
What's fascinating here is how the author connects this physical waiting period to the deliberate, willing nature of the Christian narrative of Jesus.
Oh, so?
Well, keeping the lamb for 14 days emphasized its value and its significance. It wasn't a rushed decision. The value of this sacrifice was carefully established before it was ever made.
I see.
The source connects this unblemished lamb to Jesus, the sinless Lamb of God, who offered himself willingly. The deliberation mirrors that unhurried march toward the ultimate sacrifice.
So once that unblemished lamb was selected, and its immense value was firmly established over those 14 days, its ultimate purpose became a literal matter of life and death.
Leading us to probably the most defining, visceral image of the Passover.
Exodus 12, verses 7 and 13. The Israelites were instructed to take the blood of that lamb and physically spread it on the doorposts and the lintel, the top frame of their homes.
And God's declaration is, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you."
Which is such a powerful image.
The author explains that the blood symbolizes protection from judgment. It's the physical seal of the covenant between God and his people.
And the source's spiritual reflection here is that the blood of Christ shields believers from the penalty of sin, right? Bring them out of slavery into freedom. But I have to push back here for a second. I want to ask a logistical, maybe even a psychological question about this instruction.
Okay, go ahead.
Why put the blood on the outside doorway? I mean, if God is all-knowing, he already knows exactly who is inside which house. Why couldn't they just stay quietly inside and wait it out? Why this public, messy display?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source explicitly describes this not just as a physical act, but as a spiritual declaration of trust in God's promise.
A declaration, meaning it had to be said or shown out loud to the surrounding world.
Precisely. It required an active, visible demonstration of faith. You have to remember the intense cultural context. They are in Egypt. They are a subjugated class of slaves.
Right.
To take the blood of a lamb, an animal that held sacred significance to the Egyptians, and openly smear it on your front door in a national crisis, that's a radical, dangerous act of defiance.
You are essentially painting a target on your back for the authorities.
Exactly. You're drawing a literal line in the sand. And the source parallels this to the Christian belief that salvation requires an active trust in the blood of Christ. You couldn't just secretly hope for the best while hiding inside.
You had to identify yourself with the sacrifice on the outside. That completely changes the tone of the night. It's an act of rebellion just as much as an act of faith.
It really is.
But while the blood on the outside provided the necessary protection, the highly specific actions taking place inside the house capture the raw urgency of their freedom.
The Passover meal itself, Exodus 12, verses 8 through 11.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The instructions for this meal are so intense. The lamb was to be roasted and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs.
And the posture they had to take.
Right. Eating with their belts fastened, sandals on their feet, staffs in their hands. They're basically told to eat in a state of hyper-readiness.
Ready to leave at God's command.
I try to picture this, and it's like eating dinner, standing up in your kitchen, wearing your heavy winter coat, your car keys clenched in your fist, and the engine is already running in the driveway.
It wasn't a relaxed feast.
Not at all. It was an adrenaline-fueled act of faith that they were leaving immediately.
The author synthesizes this scene by highlighting the conclusion that salvation came through strict obedience. Every single item served a distinct psychological and spiritual purpose.
Like the bitter herbs, right?
Yeah, the bitter herbs represented the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. It ensured they didn't romanticize the past when things got hard later on.
It destroys the comfortable illusion that things weren't so bad back then.
Exactly. And the unleavened bread symbolized haste. There was no time to let it rise, which forced them to look entirely to the immediate future.
And then, of course, verses 29 and 30 detail the devastating climax at midnight.
When the Lord struck down the firstborn in every Egyptian household, but spared the blood-marked homes,
demonstrating God's power, sovereignty, and mercy. Because this midnight deliverance was so foundational, it wasn't allowed to remain just a story in the past.
it was institutionalized into a continuing practice that eventually evolved as the theology expanded into the New Testament.
The Israelites were commanded to observe the Passover annually as a memorial.
And the material draws a direct line by pointing out that Jesus similarly instituted the Lord's Supper communion as a way to remember his sacrifice.
The author actually quotes Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:7 saying, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed."
So partaking in communion becomes a declaration of this sacrifice and a proclamation of his death until he returns.
The source even gives practical applications, reflecting on daily deliverance, journaling moments of redemption, sharing them to encourage others.
And approaching communion with reverence, knowing you're saved by the blood, not by works.
So what does this all mean? How does a modern reader, or maybe you, the listener, actually apply an ancient text about fleeing Egypt to a Tuesday in the 21st century?
This raises an important question. The source walked through the application and closing challenge sections, and it's really all about cultivating an active memory.
Active memory. Because human nature is prone to forgetfulness.
Exactly. Once we are comfortable, we forget the panic of the rescue. Just as the ancient Israelites were told to physically reenact the meal, the modern application involves tangible acts.
Like the journaling and communion you mentioned?
Yeah, acts to ensure gratitude doesn't fade with time.
Well, it is quite the journey we've been on today. We started with a literal ancient escape plan featuring roasted lamb and marked doorposts.
And we traced how it evolved into the foundational Christian metaphors of the Lamb of God and the practice of communion.
Understanding these historical and scriptural roots really provides a much deeper appreciation for religious texts and traditions you might encounter today.
It's not just a dusty ritual, it's a living memory.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the source material. Think about the concept of the unleavened bread.
The bread that represented haste.
Right, because there was no time to let it rise. In our own lives, we often wait for our plans, our personal transformations, or our deliverance from a bad situation to be perfectly baked.
We want the conditions to be flawless.
Exactly. We want fully risen bread before we act. But what if your next big leap requires you to move before the bread has time to rise?
That's a really challenging perspective.
Consider where in your life you might need to embrace the messy, unpolished reality of immediate action, grabbing your unleavened bread and simply stepping forward.